The day after a World Bank report said that corruption is failing India's anti-poverty programs, the government announced that it will be redefining poverty and what it means to be poor. Poverty and corruption in India, fixing the problem or fixing the country's image. This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finnegan. On Thursday, India's cabinet approved a proposal to identify people living below the poverty line and to redefine what constitutes poverty. This after a World Bank report said that attempts by the government to combat poverty aren't working. The report says that India spends more than 2% of its gross domestic product on programmes to reduce poverty, but that these programmes are beset by corruption, bad administration and underpayments and have brought only limited benefits. Although India is the world's second fastest growing economy after China, some estimates suggest that as many as 77% of its 1.2 billion people live below the poverty line. A United Nations study released last year found more people living below the poverty threshold in 8 states of India than in all of sub-Saharan Africa. We'll be discussing these issues with our guests in just a moment, but first, let's speak to Al Jazeera's Prerna Suri, who joins us now from New Delhi. This World Bank report, Prerna, can't have come as a surprise to many people in India, can it?
No, it hasn't, Adrian. This World Bank report actually confirms what many people and civil rights activist groups in this country have been saying for the last few years. And that is that while India's social welfare programs have lifted millions out of poverty, they look perfect on paper. Where their lack is in implementation. And that's what this report also highlights. For example, India's public distribution system, which guarantees food for every citizen, is quite flawed. I can give you a personal example. We went to the northern state of Haryana recently for a story on food shortage. And we were shocked to see in a government-owned storage depot millions of grains, sacks of rice and wheat just lying out in the open. That could have been used to feed millions of people in this country who suffer from malnutrition. That also reconfirms what many people are saying about India's lack of infrastructure. It simply doesn't support its social welfare programs. There aren't enough roads to actually transport the grains from the fields to people's homes. And even there in public distribution shops, mostly government-owned, people are shortchanged by getting bad quality grains. So one radical suggestion that the World Bank report is saying is that instead of having these subsidies for food within those shops, you should instead have cash subsidies and just give cash to people who really need it. Let them decide what to do with it. But it remains to be seen whether the Indian government will actually implement that or not.
Something like 70% of the population in India living below the poverty line, Prerna. Why have the economic benefits of India's boom reached so few of its people?
It's a very tough question to answer, Adrian, but I think it really lies in this lack of implementation, which I talked earlier. While India does boast a huge number of social welfare schemes, the way they're implemented and the way the common person on the street gets them is not in tune at all. You also see this lack of accountability in India's governance system. So you have corruption endemic in almost all levels. In India, there's this feeling that corruption is pervasive in all walks of life. It could be as small as paying a traffic cop to get off a fine, to as large as government officials being bribed for large defense deals or any other lucrative contracts. And we've seen that in the last few months in India as well, that while there have been enough funds for the public exchequer, there have been instances like the second generation telecom scam, in which the telecom minister basically pilfered about $38 billion from public funds, which could have been used for social welfare schemes. So there isn't much of accountability in this country, and there is a greater call for a new mechanism to be put in place.
Prerna, many thanks. Now, data on those living below the poverty line will include details about caste and religion for the first time since 1931. Under the new system, urban poor will be defined as those in shelters, people who have low-paid jobs and homes headed by women or children. Now, in rural areas, families owning landline telephones, refrigerators and farmers who have a credit limit of $1,112 won't be counted among India's poorest. Government staff, or those earning $220 or more a month, will be excluded. Homeowners with 3 or more rooms won't be classified as poor either. Well, the World Bank report said that in order to control poverty in India, the government should work on what's called a 3+ block strategy. It involves 3 sponsored programs that aim to enhance the livelihood of people in rural areas, improve access to quality medical care for casual workers, and provide food grains to the poor at a subsidised price. Lots to talk about here. Joining us are today's guests in New Delhi. Venkatesh Nayak, he's a programme coordinator at the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative. From Cambridge, England, Nayanika Mathur, a lecturer of anthropology at the University of Cambridge. And from London, Subir Sinha, a senior lecturer at the Centre of South Asian Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies. Welcome all of you to the programme. Subir, if we start with you first, is corruption endemic in Indian society?
Yes, in brief. And we've had a long history of this. If you look at colonial records going back at least 150 years, you will find corruption being mentioned widely and being perceived as a problem in every level of governance.
So how, Venkatesh, do you tackle corruption effectively, being, as it is most often, on a pretty small scale? I mean, I know there have been some very high-profile cases just recently involving former government ministers, but mostly corruption involves local officials demanding bribes to demand the most routine of public services.
Yes, of course, but I would like to correct one impression. The problem of corruption is not so new as the colonial period. In fact, the first political treatise, the Arthashastra, which was written 2000 years ago, that also mentions that corruption was endemic in India, and anybody who is a tax collector could not but filch some of the money that's collected as revenue. So we are dealing with a problem that is ages old. It's just that corruption has taken newer forms and entered newer areas and has started affecting people's lives in a big way. There are in fact 2 kinds of corruption which the Second Administrative Reforms Commission actually noted. One is corruption that is coercive, where people have to pay bribes for getting hold of even the simplest services that they are actually entitled to. And the other is collusive kind of bribery, where big business colludes with bureaucrats and makes money out of that. And that money is not necessarily something that goes into the stomachs or into the building of houses of these people. In fact, a lot of that money goes into funding electoral campaigns. This is the basic reason that democracy itself has created a situation where corruption is one way of financing campaigns for many, many candidates and probably even political parties. And that is where the serious problems lie. And it's the petty corruption which actually gets a lot of attention, where people are not able to get hold of their ration cards or their, let's say, in urban areas, telephone connections or gas connections without paying a bribe. So I think a difference that has happened in the last few years is the coming in of the Right to Information Act, where the first step towards controlling corruption or even exposing it is to bring about transparency in the manner in which government operates or the delivery of public services is conducted. So in that sense, I think some change is happening in India in terms of people's ability to contest the exercise of discretion by public authorities and also contest decisions which are manifestly corrupt in their character.
Subir, to what extent is poor governance, faulty, over-bloated government administration and red tape exacerbating the problem?
Look, I mean, in my estimation, corruption happens when there is a lot of decision-making power concentrated within, a very few governmental servants. To me, it's not a question of a bloated bureaucracy as much as it is about the concentration of decision-making power within very few people. To my mind, and, to go back to the guest from Delhi, I think Venkatesh, his point, if you looked at the ways in which corruption has happened, the fact is, over the last 20-odd years, we have had a series of reforms of the state where supposedly the state has shrunk. You can look at, for example, even the numbers of bureaucrats who get recruited on an annual basis. That's actually gone down. So to my mind, this is not necessarily something about the size of government. I think it is something to do with the way in which political power is concentrated in few hands, and basically the ways in which a political culture about using public power for private gain has held over time. Now, Venkatesh talked about the fact that even if you went back a couple of thousand years, you would find descriptions of corruptions in Kautyaya's Arthashastra, and of course that is true. But to my mind, the modern state that has come into India via colonial rule and then later as well, you find very much the kind of structure of governance that we have today, the kind of local bureaucracy and so forth that we still have, and you will find very fine-grained detail as to why this kind of corruption happens. Among other things, there has been a major lack of any kind of a systematic institutional setup of sanctioning and monitoring corrupt bureaucrats. The right to information was mentioned, and of course that is very key. We will see how that plays out. And of course, over the last 1 month or 6 weeks, we've also seen a large upsurge of public interest in corruption, precisely because a person of a Gandhian political background sat on a hunger strike in Delhi. I think Venkatesh is also right about two different kinds of corruption, and it seems to me that to lump them together and to seek one explanation won't really do. We will have to think in terms of corruption operating along different logics at these two different levels.
OK, we'll throw that back to Venkatesh in New Delhi in just a moment. But first, I want to bring in Nayanika Mathur in Cambridge, whose PhD was on the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, which had a chapter written on it in the World Bank report. Is that right?
That's right, yes, it does. I just saw the report, and there is sort of a whole section devoted to the act.
Tell me about it.
Well, I just wanted to add to what Subir just said in terms of corruption. And I think the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act is a really interesting incident or a really interesting sort of piece of legislation which is primarily aimed at cutting down corruption in rural development schemes, particularly in public works programs, which have a long history of being probably the most corrupt anti-poverty schemes in India. So my fieldwork was all based around looking at the implementation of this act. And what I found actually corroborates quite well what Subir just said, which is that it's not a problem of a bloated bureaucracy. Rather, what I found in northern India was that the rural development infrastructure is extremely weak and shaky. There's a lot of work and a lot of sort of expectations of a very weak bureaucratic apparatus, which is extremely overworked and incapable of actually dealing with the kind of demands that this legislation has put on them. And so what has actually happened is that corruption, which is precisely as Subir just said, really arose from the fact that there were very few people who were controlling the funds, and till they actually let go of the funds would not move, and hence they had access to all sorts of state grants. This particular act has tried to stop that. And I think to a large extent, in conjunction with the Right to Information Act, it has been extremely successful. And that's why I think it's a very, very interesting case study in the rural development apparatus in India currently. Did you not get a sense, though, that there was any profiteering going on within it? Oh, well, there definitely was profiteering going on. But what was interesting in this profiteering on the leakages, as the World Bank report puts it, is that due to the Right to Information Act and due to the heavy transparency and accountability clauses that have been put into this act, and, I think it's important to point out that this is actually a legal piece, so it's a legislation as opposed to just a government scheme. The fact that this was a law created a lot of sort of anxiety amongst the lower level bureaucrats in northern India, and they were quite careful to treat it with as much care as possible. So they didn't, they were very careful with making sure the records are maintained properly and that they were not actually flouting any of the regulations which were there in the act. But there was still profiteering going on. There was still a lot of sort of, for instance, fictitious assets being created, a lot of fake documents being produced. But my contention really would be that it's much lower in this particular anti-poverty scheme than it has been in other anti-poverty schemes, particularly in public works programming in India. So a lesser degree of corruption in the scheme that you studied, but in general, how do you feel, or what do you believe the solution is to making such programs suffer a lesser degree of corruption? Well, I think there's no one particular magic bullet which will eradicate corruption from at least rural development programming. As we started out talking about it in the beginning of the program, it's absolutely systemic to the development bureaucracy in India. You literally cannot move one step or have anything take place without some sort of exchange of cash or some sort of transaction, some form of transaction, whether we call it a bribe or corruption or not, some form of transaction going on at the village level and the district level. I think what the takeaway from something like the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act is that you can curtail it by creating extremely sophisticated systems and sophisticated provisions within the schemes. You can also create it by making sure that there are strong punitive outcomes if a bureaucrat or a government functionary is caught red-handed, which creates a lot of fear in the system and makes people more cautious in the dealings with it. But I think a lot of it also has to do with things like these mechanisms of, say, social audits and empowering local communities to actually be able to question the actions of government officials, which up till quite recently they were not really able to do, and they were completely dependent on the beneficence of state officials coming in and giving them state lodges.
Venkatesh, I just want to ask you for your opinion on the provincial elections on May 14th, in which incumbent governments were swept away in 4 out of 5 states. To what extent do you think that shows that the burgeoning middle class in India is now consolidating as a potent political force, and what are its implications on what we're talking about here, poverty and corruption in India?
I'm afraid it's a little too premature to make those kinds of connections, because what needs to be considered is the voter turnout in most of these states. It was a phenomenal 70 to 85%, and I do not think that the responsibility for such a huge voter turnout can be placed at the doors of the Indian middle class. If we look at the Indian middle class, especially in urban areas, these are the people most of the time who do not go out and vote. It is people in large numbers who've turned out in rural areas who must be given the credit for changing governments here. And I think part of the credit also goes to the Election Commission, which has been successful in ensuring that booth capturing, rigging of votes has not happened to the extent that it used to happen earlier. And I think that's the major reason there has been the use of electronic voting machines. But keeping that, those technical reasons for the huge voter turnout aside, I think corruption was a major issue in West Bengal. It was definitely a major issue in Tamil Nadu as well. I'm not so sure about Pondicherry, because very little news about that trickles to the national media. But corruption has played a major factor. It's played a major role in the change of governments here, and it has always done so. This is not for the first time that it has happened. I come from a state of Karnataka where successive governments have changed. People have voted power, parties and alliances out of power because of their corrupt nature. But there is also another issue to be borne in mind, that there is no alternative. You cannot identify a single party today that is that has a regional existence, or let us say even a national identity, that is corruption free. So who are people to choose from? That's point number one. The other point that needs to be factored in and taken serious note of is the high level of tolerance for corruption in urban areas. You talk to people in metros, you talk to people in Class B cities. It's taken for granted that you have to pay bribes to get some service or the other, and that's become a fact of life. Why isn't that the kind of angst that comes out on streets when people like Anna Hazare come out and fast for a Lokpal bill? Why does that not happen every day? Why do people simply not refuse, especially those who can afford to pay bribes? Those who can afford to pay bribes, why can they not come out and say that I refuse to pay a bribe, I'm going to use right to information and check why my entitled service or whatever benefit I'm supposed to get from government is not working? If people start doing this, especially the educated people, I think the effect of such a intervention, mass-based intervention, would be much more than what we see every 5 years. What is required is when people come out. Now, the previous speaker, Mrs. Mathur, talked about the power of social audits. I completely agree with her. Social audits are a unique and phenomenal way of getting people involved in accountability mechanisms. But what happens after social audit? Where is action taken by the bureaucracy to punish the corrupt? How much time delay is there? Why do people get promotions despite the fact that they are charged of corruption? These are the larger systemic issues that must be taken into account. And here I would like to place the blame squarely at the doors of our elected representatives, especially the legislators and parliamentarians. How much action have they taken to ensure that corruption is tackled with in all seriousness in their own constituencies? Some probably might be doing it, but it's not happening at the larger level.
Okay.
A way of handling corruption is to look at when departments place their demand for grants, when their budgets are being discussed in the legislatures. How much action is taken? What kinds of questions are being asked? What is being done about finding out why is it that corruption cases are not going forward?
Okay. Subir,
Can I just come in
the
on
law,
this?
yes, by all means, please.
Yeah, in fact, to respond to both something that Nayanika said as well as something that Venkatesh said, on the question of social audits and the right to information, you will regularly read in the papers that activists who are following the right to information have threats to their lives and also sometimes are killed. Information is very powerful, and obviously those whose activities will be exposed through greater access to information feel threatened by this and sometimes will take revenge on activists who try to use the right to information. And likewise, on the question of social audits, I think partly it depends on what part of the country you're talking about. So if you're looking at some parts of the country like Madhya Pradesh or Rajasthan, where you've had social movements around the question of social audits, particularly as it affects the rural employment guarantee schemes, then they've been more successful. Otherwise, in fact, just a few days ago, we've had the murder of another of these rural employment guarantee activists in the state of Jharkhand, who's actually been working fairly closely with one of the people who wrote the scheme, Jean Reyes. So that's on the one side. On the second side, to sort of take further the point that Venkatesh was making, I don't really see an opposition between the middle classes and corruption. I mean, the middle classes are not only paying money and bribes on a regular basis, but also recipients of that. And it seems to me that one of the middle classes want to get a number of things done which they can't get done through entirely legal processes. These might include, for example, encroaching on public lands when they have their own apartments or their own buildings, jumping queue, for example, for medical or educational institutional admission. So the middle classes have a very paradoxical role in all of this. On the one hand, they would not like to be seen as being a part of the country that ranks very badly on global lists of corrupt countries. On the other hand, they seem to be active agents both in terms of receiving as well as giving bribes. So to my mind, it does not necessarily, the upsurge or resurgence of the middle class is not in itself a way to deal with corruption. I think something else needs to happen.
We're rapidly coming towards the end of the programme. I want to give the final word to Nayanika here in Cambridge. The law, Nayanika, treats bribe giving as well as bribe taking as a crime. That makes it pretty hard for people to blow the whistle. Picking up on what both the gentlemen were saying there, to what extent is one explanation for India's problems is that the rule of law is more rhetorical than real. I mean, the law is owned by the politically powerful and the economically wealthy in India, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. I couldn't agree more with you. And I think this, to treat bribe giving and bribe taking at the same level is absolutely, it's terrible. That, because again, if you look at rural India, you cannot actually subsist on a daily basis without giving small bribes or whatever form that they might be. It would be absolutely unfair to treat a woman living in sort of Himalayan India, running a household on her own, if she gives a bribe to the local village headman so that she can get work on a rural employment program, to treat her at the same level as to be treating a senior bureaucrat who's making sort of millions of rupees out of these development schemes, it's absolutely terrible. So you're absolutely right. The rule of law is really, law is very much something that's in the hands of the powerful.
OK, we'll have to leave it there. The news waits for no man, and we're out of time. Many thanks to our guests, Venkatesh Nayak, Nayanika Mathur and Subir Sinha. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. As always, we welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. From all of us on the team, bye for now.